Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Race and Education Film Club evening. I'm speaking to you in retrospect, so I'm here today with our esteemed guest, uh, Robert Beckford. So I'm going to read his bio. We're going to do a decolonial check-in, and then we will jump into the questions. So, Robert Beckford is a professor of theology in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at VU University in Amsterdam. And in addition to this, he is also a professoral research fellow at Queen's Foundation in Birmingham. Robert is a scholar activist specializing in the intersection of theology, race, and resistance in the Black religions of the Black Atlantic. He has written 8 monographs in this field, including the forthcoming Decolonizing Contemporary Gospel Music Through Praxis, Handsworth Revolutions. Robert also produces knowledge across various media, including television and radio documentaries, drama productions, and contemporary Black music. His most recent radio documentary series, Windrush, A Family Divided, and Should I Change My Name, are available on BBC iPlayer. His most recent independent film, After the Flood, The Church, Slavery and Reconciliation, has been shortlisted for a Stanford St. Martin Award for Religious Journalism and Podcasting. Robert has won several international awards for his research, including a BAFTA, Jamaica National Diaspora Award, and an International Pentecostal Scholars Award. So, as I'm sure this says everything and hints at so much more. So, thank you, Robert, and welcome. Was there anything you wish to add? Was there anything I
Oh, that's all
missed?
good. That's all good. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you.
No worries. Right. So, in keeping with our race and education film club tradition, I am going to share my screen and engage in a decolonial check-in with you. So, in keeping with our anti-racist and decolonial principles and overtones and undertones, as it were, part of our decolonial way of existing in such spaces is that we seek to identify and dismantle the colonial logic which appears within the Cartesian dualistic split, which argues that the mind and the body are separate antagonistic entities constantly at war with each other, constantly in conflict, constantly trying to superimpose itself over each other. Rather, we reject this in its entirety with the intention of being holistically present. This requires us to engage with having an embodied experience. So we have to trust our bodies, we have to witness our bodies, and we have to witness our bodies witnessing the world around us. And we do this through engaging with our senses. So the senses that I have selected are the eyes, the ears, and the heart. So, Robert, in terms of eyes, what are you reading and watching? In terms of ears, what are you listening to? Music, podcast, or a book? And in terms of your heart, what's on your heart and how do you feel?
Oh, these are great questions. What I'm reading at the moment is a book on photographic portraiture by Birmingham's world famous photographer Vanley Burke. Vanley Burke has spent 50 years cataloguing African Caribbean diaspora people as they live, marry, work, die, go to church, go to raves in Birmingham. So I'm rereading his work as part of a piece I am writing about reparations and how Black self-repair is explored in photographic portraiture alongside other media. In terms of what I'm listening to UK hip hop, Bashi, the album Being Poor is Expensive, because it's a album which entangles issues of faith, justice, redemption, overcoming Black enterprise, Black joy, and also resistance and re-existence. It's a fantastic album, and I'm planning to run a seminar on the album and its pedagogic value next year in London. And then what's on my heart at the moment? That's a good question. I would say um, the the genocide taking place in Palestine, and also the genocidal conditions in Sudan at the moment in time are heavily upon my heart, as is the ongoing war in Ukraine and the way in which that seems to be escalating as we talk, as we know that potentially troops from North Korea are going to be supporting Putin. So I guess this morning, hearing the news, I was reminded of the wars that are taking place at this moment in time and how tragic all of them are, and the ones that I haven't mentioned in this time. So yeah, the genocidal conditions that many people face globally is on my heart.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that very generous and powerful offering. Right, I'm also going to do a decolonial check-in. So in terms of what I'm reading or watching, so I'm a full-time student again, so I've for a brief time at least left the classroom. So I do nothing but read academic journals and academic texts, fall asleep reading, wake up reading. So it's literally all I do in my life. Janet's watching this, so I'm really going to really sort of
Mhm.
involve that. But when I'm not engrossed in my work, to just sort of relax and try to find that balance, I watch my favorite detective program, Monk. Don't know if anyone's familiar with it.
Yeah,
This might be
yeah.
before your time, Robert. It's a bit.
No,
I'm
I know.
slightly older than you, Robert. So,
Mm, mm, mm.
so yes, Adrian Monk. He's one of my favorite. He is my favorite detective. I think he's brilliant. And I just enjoy watching the sort of thought process of how he finds out who committed the murder. I just find him brilliant. In terms of ears, what am I listening to? As always, I'm delighting in all things Afro beats and Amapiano. But I'm listening to the audiobook Vagabonds. I think I have it with me by Alisoga Osionde.
Right.
And it's Black queer fiction, which speaks about the multiple worlds of Lagos, Nigeria, um, the things that we don't speak about. It's really powerful, really, really powerful. I'm enjoying it a lot. I don't really like fiction as I'm learning, but the language in this is beautiful. A particular line that has really stood out to me is something happened and the person who was, I guess, victimized by that particular action described their feelings as rebellion hissed up my spine. And
Mm,
I just thought that was very palpable.
mm,
And yeah, I'm enjoying the language of the book.
mm.
And in terms of what's on my heart, as I said, I'm a full-time student again. So going from teacher to student has been a very humbling transition. And I've relocated to a different city as well. So with all the excitement and the sort of difficulties that comes with that, it's sort of quite strong at times. And I'm also very excited to be here with you, Robert. So feeling all the things at the moment.
Fantastic.
Yes. Okay, so Robert, are you ready for the questions?
Yeah, far away.
Okay, so the first question is why did you decide to create the documentary The Empire Pays Back in 2005?
Yes, a great question. I'd say there are three things that have coalesced to make that film possible. First of all, we have to pay tribute to Rastafari, the movement in Britain and the Caribbean, which for decades kept alive the theme of reparations, reparatory justice through music, through art, through embodied forms of cultural expression. And I grew up with that tradition in the Midlands in Britain in the 1970s and 1980s. So Rastafari imbued within me a consciousness of reparatory justice, reparations for African diaspora people, particularly people of the Caribbean diaspora. So that was in my consciousness. And secondly, I have to give credit to Channel 4, the production company that made the film. I was a employee of Channel 4 while working as a university lecturer. You know, we Jamaicans like to have two jobs. So I had a little side hustle at the time, making films for Channel 4. And I have to give credit to the then commissioning editor, the person who commissioned films for the television station, Akil Ahmed, because he was a working class Pakistani from the north of England and understood me as a working class black man from the Midlands when I said I wanted to make a film on reparations. He had a similar conscientization through Rastafari black music and understood the theme. And therefore, when I presented it to him as a project that I wanted to make that year, he completely agreed and said, what do you need to go about doing it? I suppose the third reason was because I wanted to explore the harm dimension of reparations. Reparations is often split into two parts: repair, which we know about how we repair the damage, and then the harm focus. And the harm focus is what was actually done to African people in transatlantic chattel slavery. And in order to demonstrate the harm, we went for the compensation focus, the monetary dimension of reparations. Now, reparations isn't completely about that. If you go to the European Court of Human Rights or the UN, they'll tell you reparations is more complex, it has several features. Similarly, reparatory justice, the kind of religious inspired version of reparations, it's a holistic process. So we were aware of that, but we knew that to make this theme stick and get a decent audience, if we focused on financial compensation, we would be able to ensure that people understood the harm that was done to enslaved Africans by virtue of how much compensation their descendants today are due as a consequence.
Thank you for such a robust and sort of reflective and conscious answer. My second question is, what would make reparations, and what would it entail?
Yeah, that's a good question. For me, reparations and reparatory justice are distinct, but there are ways in which they overlap. So for me, what is reparations? Reparations fundamentally for transatlantic chattel slavery in terms of the West Indies would mean addressing the five basic elements of reparations. First of all, there has to be some form of restoration for African Caribbean people. And restoration comes in a variety of forms. For some people, it's return to Africa. For some people, it's engagement with their consciousness as African people. For some people, restoration is just an apology and acknowledging the harm that was done. I think alongside restoration, there has to be, as I've kind of alluded to in the film, compensation. We need to address the fact that transatlantic chattel slavery was economic exploitation of Black bodies. It was also racial terror, and we need to account for that through some kind of financial compensation. But that's not enough. We need some reconciliation to take place, and for that to happen, we need some kind of truth and reconciliation process where we acknowledge the harm that was done, we acknowledge the history, we truth seek so that it's on the table and people are aware of what has taken place. And as a consequence of that, we then engage in processes of non-reoccurrence. We make sure that this will not happen again, because although transatlantic chattel may have ended, we know that there are other forms of slavery in the historical social world. And also we know that African Caribbean people at abolition in 1834, 1838, just simply moved from slave labor to wage labor. So we've got to look at how slavery has a continued impact in terms of the economic realities of life faced by people in the Caribbean and their diaspora in Britain as well. And then I think as a fifth element of that, because we want to be restored, we want compensation, we want some kind of truth and reconciliation. We also want to make sure that there is non-reoccurrence. There needs to be reorientation or some kind of psychological cultural healing that takes place, because people have been damaged and traumatized by not just the history of slavery, but by its consequence. And in Britain, its most evident continuity is racialized oppression. So I think we have to look at rehabilitative processes for African diaspora people, and also people who have been part of the perpetrator class as well. How do we rehabilitate that class? So for me, those five elements of reparations are crucial to having a restorative process. We could also throw in there something like reconciliation, which is a feature of reparatory justice, which is non-punitive in the way in which it organizes reconciliation. So we could look at, well, what does reconciliation mean for the descendants of enslaved people and the descendants of the perpetrators? How might that look? And for me, I think that is about cooperating for social justice, racial justice, going into the future. So those elements for me is how reparations would take place and its features going forward.
Thank you for that. You've said so much. I just want to draw upon a few things. So in your mind, would reparations without an apology be hollow?
I think that both are needed. An apology without action is a hollow apology. And actually, an apology is really incomplete because it doesn't show remorse. It doesn't show any kind of empathy in terms of understanding the predicament and the history. So I would ask for both. There's a book by Cohen which explores the philosophy of apology, and he argues that an apology to be genuine has to be not only a verbal acknowledgement with empathy, it has to also be backed up with action, some kind of reparatory justice. So I think it's both and rather than either or.
Okay, thank you. Are you familiar with what Keir Starmer said? I think within the last few
That's
days or
right.
so.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Keir Starmer said reparations is not on the agenda of the forthcoming Commonwealth summit, where all the Commonwealth heads get together. And I think
Yeah.
that's inevitable because he's following in the footsteps of David Cameron, the last prime minister to be in a position where he could raise the issue of reparations with the Commonwealth heads. And the reason why he's not doing that is threefold. One, because he knows that once you acknowledge guilt, then there's culpability, and the Caribbean nations
Yes.
would be coming for them. I think that's part of it. I think the second thing is that his own ignorance. I don't think Keir Starmer is fully conversant with the history of slavery, colonization, and its continued impact. We have to remember that most people in Britain do not learn this history in schools. There are only a handful of universities and institutions that teach slave and colonial history. And as a consequence, we have promoted solipsism within our culture, an institutionalization of ignorance when it comes to understanding slavery and its consequence in Britain. And it's kind of ironic in Britain because we do a really good job at remembering the past. So we've done a real job on what Stuart Hall called selective amnesia. We're brilliant at forgetting the harms that were done to Black and brown people in colonialism, but we're brilliant remembering the things that the odd abolitionist did or reformer did to end or participate in the end of slavery or colonialism. So yeah, there's that dimension to what Keir Starmer is doing as well. And I think the third thing is this: look, I don't think he has the moral courage to do it. I think to stand up and acknowledge the atrocities that Britain has been involved in, and to hold them in tension with the moments of good things that Britain has done. There's a continuity, there's a tension at work. Parts of colonialism in some parts of the world is heralded as the pinnacle of civilization, where in other parts of the world, like the West Indies, it's seen as the underside of the colonial enterprise. It's the worst that could ever happen to people. So we have to hold that in tension. But for me, he doesn't have the courage to push this agenda forward and have that kind of creative imagination on the subject. But it's not going to go away.
No,
Because
exactly.
your political realities won't let it go away. The Caribbean people won't let it go away. And given that China is big in the Caribbean, big in parts of Africa, it may be that reparations is transcoded by this country eventually into some kind of soft power activity in the Southern Hemisphere.
No, I think that's a really good point. That's a really good. But I mean, if just you're saying so much. Lastly, on this second point that you just raised, do you think that South Africa is a good model for the reconciliation process?
No, and I don't. I say that for two reasons primarily. Well, one, because contemporary South Africa has not radically transformed itself into an egalitarian and equitable society. The
Yes.
coloniality and colonization of apartheid is very much still structured in terms of economic resources, where they how they're distributed, in terms of power, who holds the power, and fundamentally the economic arrangements haven't changed. A small white elite still owns much of the country's wealth. So consequently, if you were to blink and go from 1992 to 2024, you'd think that very little had changed apart from having a black elite who are in power and who have been, unfortunately, at times quite corrupt. So I don't think it's a really good example for that reason in the present. And I think projecting back, if we look at the Truth and Reconciliation process, it was faulty. It was faulty for two reasons. One, because it was underlined by a false notion of Christian forgiveness. Desmond Tutu went around telling everybody to forgive at all costs. Well, that's not completely New Testament. There are always conditions associated with forgiveness in the New Testament. It's not, you don't just keep forgiving people if they're always stabbing you back or doing you in. There's a different process that the New Testament requires for that kind of continued oppression. And equally, it failed because it did not allow any kind of sanction for the perpetrators. They were able to talk about what they'd done and then receive automatic forgiveness. It's hugely problematic. And if Black psychology in the Black Atlantic is correct, there is a problem for people who have been brutalized by racial terror and by colonialism in theology, because we are, as part of that process of brutalization and colonial Christianity, we are taught to forgive our oppressors no matter what. And that's what I saw being played out then. And sadly, as brilliant peacemaker Desmond Tutu was when it came to his theology of forgiveness. He completely failed. He engaged in cheap grace. He made it too easy for
Yes.
people who had committed crimes and sometimes crimes against humanity to walk away without any apology, any remorse, and without any sanction.
No, I think that's a brilliant point. Cheap grace, very, very much so. Thinking of Dietrich Bonhoeffer
Mm-hmm.
now. Yes, yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. Right. I'm going to stick to the script
Yeah, no
because
good.
you're,
All
yeah.
good. All good.
Okay. Thank you, Robert, as always. So my third question is, if you were given the opportunity to redo or create a second part to the documentary, what would it include?
Oh, we've done it already, so I can advertise it. It's the film, the follow-up film we made in 2021. I made this as a charitable enterprise for the charity called the Movement for Justice and Reconciliation. So the film is on their website. It's a racial justice charity. So the film is behind a very, very small paywall. It's a very small amount that you have to pay to watch it. And the film is called After the Flood, the Churches,
Oh,
Slavery and Reconciliation. And this film is basically a black person's, or for want of a better word, a victim-led approach to understanding reparations, because there are currently in Britain perpetrator-led approaches to reparations. We've got
yes.
descendants of slave families. We have institutions like the Church of England, corporations like Lloyd's Bank, educational institutions like Cambridge University, who are the perpetrator class, who benefited from the trade in black flesh. And they're doing their version of reparations as perpetrator reparations. Now, I grew up with the Irish and Italian a mob in Coventry back in the 1970s. And perpetrator justice, I learned from them, is no justice. That's mafia. You know, they're the only people who commit the crime and then tell the judge how the sentence should go. And unfortunately, that's happening with reparations in Britain. The people who perpetrated the crimes and who benefited from them are now determining the sentence. So what I wanted to do was establish a victim-led approach, not because we're promoting victimization, but instead a contextual approach to reparations based on the experience of African Caribbean Christians in Britain. So the film tells the story of how churches got involved in slavery theologically through doctrinal themes such as the curse of Ham, how they helped to create categories of racial hierarchy, whiteness in particular, through the church's engagement with the race codes in Barbados in the 1700s, and how it created the category of Christian slavery. It argued that enslaved Africans should be enslaved, but we can still make them Christian. It restricted the sphere of salvation, which is hugely problematic, has consequences for today. But then we wanted to talk about how the church could get itself out of this predicament. What does reparations look like in terms of reconciliatory action? So we use the work, and we're very pleased to have the brilliant theologian Miroslav Volf in the film from Yale, and equally the brilliant theologian Willie Jennings from Yale in the film, to help guide us on how to think about reparations and restorative justice in the contemporary world. So that film has been made, and I can throw in a few others as well, you see, because I was then also able to make a two-part series for BBC Radio, which is called The Church's Slave Plantation. It's on BBC iPlayer, two-part radio program that looks at the plantation that was owned by the Church of England's missionary arm, the United Society for Propagation of the Gospel, as it was known then. And they had a plantation with about 900 enslaved Africans over 130 years that they ran as a going concern. The history has been suppressed, obviously, because, you know, Church of England doesn't really want to talk about the fact that it was one of the few denominations to run a plantation during the slave period. But we made a two-part series about that. And then again, finally, looking at traditions of repair, I made a program earlier this year for BBC World Service Again, which is called Should I Change My Name? And that explores the trauma, inherited trauma with having slave names, and how we attempt to redeem them or atone for them in some way. So I talk to people in the program about their names, their surnames, which are brands from slavery, or in some case for Dalit Christians, for example, their names are Christian names that they take on in order to get better treatment, you know, because their Dalit names identify them as a subservient class in India and in Britain as well. So we wanted to look at how names that have oppressive histories are redeemed or atoned in the present. And I looked at my own surname, Beckford, which is a slave holding name from the northwest of Jamaica. I wanted to look at how I might redeem that name, and I ended up with a kind of compromise, which is a strike through, which represents the tension of not knowing the real history behind my not knowing my own real name in terms of my African name. Although DNA tells us where we're from now, though, which is helpful, but also recognition that this name has some value for Jamaican people, because when I go home to Jamaica, people know me as a Beckford, and that has a different resonance, as a wholesome, familial, empowering resonance for Jamaican people of Beckford heritage in Jamaica, but it's obviously thought of differently in the diaspora. So that's a long answer. So yes, made 3 productions since then, which are part of the project to explore reparatory justice and reparations.
That is so interesting. And the strike through your name is reminiscent of members who join the Nation of Islam and put the X until they take on a quote
That's
unquote
right.
Muslim.
Although I like to give credit where credit is due, there's a scholar in Birmingham called Nathaniel Tobias Coleman, and he's been doing this for some time, strike through his surname. And so I appropriated that tradition from him. And it just represents the tension that we are part of a diaspora, that there's a both and existence, being both African and Caribbean, but there's also something which is unknown, as well as something which is known about who we are.
Of course. Thank you for that. It's I also struggle with the tension of my surname as well, so I will definitely look into that. Thank you. My next question is, what did you find most rewarding and challenging about the process?
That's a good question. I think the most challenging and rewarding thing has been how the film has been used around the world by different communities in struggle as a template for compensation as a feature of reparations. And that's been, that wasn't necessarily part of the process of making the film, but the outcome has been fantastic. People in Jamaican, the University of the West Indies for decades used the film as a key research tool for understanding slavery, colonialism, and its recompense. Likewise, across North America as well. Many universities and colleges who have used the film as well. So I would say the outcome has been really, really powerful. But in terms of the process of making it was actually quite difficult. Difficult emotionally in terms of revisiting this history, finding out things about my own family history. I find an enslaved African named Robert Beckford, who was part of the 1831 Baptist Rebellion. I had to deal with some really conservative people who didn't necessarily agree with reparations. Many of them have changed their minds now, the passing of time. And that was always tricky. And even going to the Home Office and speaking to a minister of the government about this issue was also quite intense and difficult. So the process itself is never easy in terms of filmmaking. There are very few moments of joy and ecstasy because it's the budgets aren't great and they expect high quality in a very short period of time in terms of filmmaking. So there's always a lot of tension involved. But the outcome for me has been more than I could ever have hoped for.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. I have 2 more questions for you. My next question is, how do you see this documentary being used in secondary schools and in higher education?
Oh, wow, that's great. Well, I hope it still has some life because we made it in 2005 when I had a lot more hair back then. So, and I was at younger features. So I'm just happy that people are still using it and thinking that's how I look. That's good news for me, So I think that given that reparations is now on the agenda, it's on the agenda across North America. There are, I think last time I checked, there were at least 30 plus reparations projects taking place connected to either slavery or Jim Crow in North America. So I think the film has value for people who are interested in the metrics. How do we compensate? Eligibility is a big theme, who's eligible, but also how do we compensate and how do we measure? So we use measures from international law. As a consequence of that, the Brattle Group have developed a 5 metric approach to reparations. You can read that online, the Brattle Group report on reparations. It was partly inspired by the former High Court judge at the European Court of Human Rights, His Excellency Judge Patrick Robinson. So yeah, so I think it's important for people who want to do the metric side and look at the harm side of it. So yes, it should be used in that way. And I'm glad it's been used that way in North America and the Caribbean, and to an extent still within the UK as well.
Great, thank you. And my final question is more of a provocation. Did you wish to share any thoughts, comments, or reflections on the film or the documentary, or your thoughts regarding reparative justice before we close?
Yeah, I think that we're on the verge of what I call now the Great Reparations ripoff. And the reason why I say that is because basically what's happened since the birth of the movement, which was fundamentally about Rastafari in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, by the 1990s, reparations became a focal point for activists, educational activists, university professors. I mean, I became a part of it at that moment in time. But what's happened since then is that governments have got involved, the CARICOM nations have got involved, and as a consequence of that, many of the key issues and themes that people fought for prior have been watered down or has disappeared. So I think we're at a crucial point where the ripoff consists of the discourse being controlled no longer by people of African heritage, but by white liberals in Britain. If you search for reparations online, you'll see that the heirs of slavery comes up, which is a white perpetrator organization, or Laura Trevelyan, the journalist who is part of this movement, the heirs of slavery, or people like Banner, Dr. Banner, who wrote the book Britain's Black Debt, or is it Britain's Slave? No, Reparations Now. I think so. Britain's Slave Debt, Reparations Now. Michael Banner, and his name comes up, and these are all people racialized as white. Now, I'm not against them being part of the movement, but I think that they should be following, not leading. So the discourse at the moment is being dominated by the perpetrator class, and perpetrator justice isn't the same as victim justice.
No, it isn't.
And the second theme as a consequence of that is you control the discourse, you control the money. And as a consequence, all the discourse around financial settlement has been completely watered down. A good example of this is United Society for Partnership in the Gospel, the organization that was previously involved in holding a slave plantation for the Anglican Church, running a slave plantation for the Anglican Church in Barbados. They struck a deal of £7 million, 900 enslaved Africans over 130 years. It should be something in the region of 6 billion, so that's an example of perpetrator justice. It's bargain basement reparations as far as they're concerned. So yeah, Laura Trevelyan gave £100,000 to a cause in Grenada. Other people have set up charity. Charity is not reparations. It's not. So they've controlled the discourse, controlled the money, and ultimately, I think what's going to happen is they'll control the vast majority of the people. So I see contemporary reparations now descending into a form of neo-colonial charitable enterprise, which will ultimately be used to monitor, control Black activism, Black enterprise within Britain for the next decade.
That's a very stark and uncompromising, but very honest.
And the reason I say that is because they're setting up, the perpetrator traditions are setting up charities, and they're setting up on traditional colonial charitable lines, not decolonizing, as we've been asking for the last 20 years, decolonizing charities. And they will pick and choose who gets the money. So who will get funding for educational projects? It'll be the people that the perpetrator class like. Won't be people like me. I won't get a penny. I expected anything, so and we know how funding regimes that are liberal work in terms of suppressing forms of Black radical action and justice. So for me, I'm really worried about the future of the movement in Britain. At least I think it's on the verge of collapsing into what I've called the Great Reparations ripoff.
Thank you, Robert. Very sobering closing thoughts. Thank you, Robert. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
And
I appreciate it.
Look forward to seeing you again shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you.